Welcome to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Join us as we dive into the world of endurance sports, exploring everything from nutrition to training and how these elements shape your everyday life, both on and off the race course. Hosted by Coach Justin, certified run and triathlon coach and owner of Tabula Rasa Racing, along with Coach Katie, a registered dietitian specializing in sports nutrition and owner of Fuel to Run. We're here to share insights and real-world advice to help you thrive on your journey. Here at the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast is where your journey begins.
Hey everybody, this is Katie, and I am doing a solo deep dive today, so Justin won't be with me, but I'm hoping that this will be informative. I wanted to sort of lay the groundwork today and talk basics. So future topics or future deep dives might be more of a true deep dive into a very specific supplement or diet or protocol or, something very specific to nutrition. But today I wanted to really focus on sports nutrition and just sort of what it is. What does that mean? Like that word, that concept. How is sports nutrition different than your regular standard diet? We'll talk a bit about the differences between what an athlete might follow or the diet an athlete might follow versus the general population. I also wanted to dig a little bit more into the dietary guidelines. If you listened to our podcast last week, you probably heard some of my positive things that I said about it, some of my criticisms of the new dietary guidelines, some of the things that I would like to see now that they put that out, like let's follow this up with some action. But today I'm not going to talk about in a critical sense. I'm going to talk more about how that dietary guidelines that they put out doesn't necessarily always jive with what an athlete might want to do. So for an athlete, we really don't necessarily need to follow the dietary guidelines. In fact, it's probably different. If I had to create my own dietary guidelines for athletes, it would be a bit different. And it actually may differ quite a bit from day to day too. So that's kind of more standard for the standard, person who's not maybe exercising more than 150 minutes or even 3 hours a week, arguably. Anybody that's doing more than that probably needs to change their diet a bit and would benefit from a slightly different approach than what is on the dietary guidelines. So I'm going to dive into that as part of this as well. And I'm going to talk lastly about sports dietitians, sports nutritionists. What's the difference between the two, dietitian versus nutritionist? What does that mean? And what might you be looking for if you're going to seek out help from somebody, from an expert? And what makes somebody an expert in this field? Because I think that can be confusing too, especially when, unfortunately, we're sort of inundated with a bunch of information online, and a lot of people on Instagram or TikTok or YouTube want to put themselves out there as if they are experts. And just because somebody is good at running or runs a lot or is an influencer of some sort or, I don't know, just likes to read doesn't mean that they're an expert in something. So just being able to discriminate a little bit there and what that might look like and how to know when you're talking to someone or when you're looking at something online, does that person really know what they're talking about? Because I think sometimes people can be pretty influential, or they can present information in a way that's very convincing and unfortunately not always helpful. Let's dive in before I get down a deep rabbit hole there. So I wanted to talk first about what is sports nutrition, how is it different from a regular diet or regular nutrition, I suppose. And obviously there's lots of different diets out there and so forth. So we're kind of just talking about the general recommendations for health that might be put forward. And so it's obviously, we think of sports nutrition, we're thinking of specific to athletes. So that's a big difference, is just regular nutrition might be specific to just somebody trying to be a little bit healthier, change their diet a little bit, or maybe even somebody focusing on weight loss Whereas sports nutrition is really focused on athlete. And sometimes that's where it gets a little bit fuzzy is how we define an athlete, because in my opinion, just because somebody isn't a high level athlete doing Ironmans or marathons at a high level, or maybe they're not necessarily an elite athlete. I do think that most people who train or do some sort of exercise that's more than probably about 3 hours a week. So somebody going to 5 days a week of a CrossFit training gym, or, maybe doing strength training more than 3 hours a week, or somebody that plays pickleball and they play pickleball every night, 3 or 4 nights a week, and they're playing for longer than an hour. That technically could be defined as an athlete, because that person is putting a lot of effort in it. And they're, even if they're not playing necessarily competitively, they're still training hard. And so their needs are still going to be a bit different. So I'm putting that out there, is that the definition of an athlete, may differ a little bit, but generally that's kind of how I think of it. And I don't know, if there is a specific time limit, like, oh, you have to be doing this amount or more, or you're not an athlete. I think you're an athlete if you're training for something and you have a goal, like improving muscle mass or fitness, or maybe getting better at pickleball, or, various things like that. So that's kind of how I define an athlete. And obviously within that, there's going to be different levels. So we have, people who are training a little bit less, and then people who maybe are doing like an Ironman or like an ultra distance event, and they're spending more than 10 hours a week training. Their needs are gonna differ a bit as well, so than somebody only training 3 hours. So we don't wanna get into the weeds too much, but just something to consider is that as your levels of activity go up, the needs change a little bit, or maybe sometimes quite a bit. So basically, the way I think of it is you take the basic tenets of a healthy diet, so an athlete or a sports nutrition may be taking those basic tenets of a healthy diet, and that's kind of the basis, and then is kind of building on from there. And so you might have, okay, I really want most people to get, 5 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables every day. Optimally, we would be getting, maybe on the minimum side, one, but maybe up to like 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein. So there would be that. And some people might be needing a little more than that, but that's where where the add-ons kind of come in with sports nutrition. Maybe for the basic diet, we're keeping grains and, to mostly whole grains, not a lot of processed food, trying to really keep the diet nice and mostly clean and mostly unprocessed, right? So that would be like the basic diet. For an athlete, then it's kind of building on that based off needs. So most athletes who are training more than 3 hours a week will need more carbohydrate. So the amount of grains or starch, so it could be starchy vegetables, will go up for that individual. So their needs grow a little bit in that area. They might be aiming for a few more fruits and vegetables, but that might not go up substantially. It depends, because the more fiber an athlete eats, or the more fiber we eat, the harder it is to get sometimes enough energy. So I might not change that goal for fruits and vegetables too much, but I might increase a little bit their protein goal. And so things will change a little bit for an athlete. Certain components of the diet go up for athletes, whereas we wouldn't want somebody who is just training or exercising 150 minutes a week and maybe trying to lose weight. We wouldn't want them to eat a substantially larger portion of those carbohydrate foods, because that might cause weight gain. And because their body, they're not burning that energy, they're not needing that extra energy for fuel, those carbs, that could also lead to things like diabetes. But for an athlete, because when you're burning through lots of calories and lots of energy, carbs are definitely going to be, in most cases, something that we're going to need more of. So there's definitely going to be some changes there. I'll talk a little bit about, maybe even share a visual of a plate model and talk about the dietary guidelines as it compares to what an athlete might want to do. But basically, it's just kind of like the basic diet, and then athletes build upon that. The other way to think of it is most people who are eating a general diet, they might eat, 3 meals a day and maybe a snack. But somebody who is an athlete might be eating a lot more than that, or at least maybe more snacks. So I think of myself, I'll just use myself an example because it's easy to do, because I know myself pretty well. But let's say I exercise or do my run in the morning? Well, I might eat a high carbohydrate meal or, snack meal, breakfast before I go out. Maybe at 6:30, 7 in the morning, I might have a bowl of oatmeal with some peanut butter, maybe a little bit of whey protein in there, depending on when I'm going out for my run. Go out and run, and then I'll almost have like a second breakfast after I get back. It could be like a smoothie or a shake, depending on the timing. Maybe I'll do a bowl of Greek yogurt with berries or fruit and some granola and some nuts. It just depends on what I feel like, but just something higher in protein or maybe a little healthy fat. That would be like my second breakfast. So I already had two breakfasts, and maybe that's already by 10 or 11 or 9, or depending on how early I went on my run. And then I might have lunch, which would be a pretty standard lunch. But let's say I'm doing another strength training session in the afternoon. So I'm going to do 2 workouts that day. My lunch, maybe in that case, I want to make sure it's going to have a good amount of protein, and I might want to add a little bit more carbs. So I might have, a sandwich with some meat or some kind of protein in it and, some salad on the side. And then I might want to also add some additional fruit for more carb, just kind of adding in more carb. And that lunch meal might be a little bit bigger. And then let's say I'm going to work out again at 4 p.m. or do a strength training session. I might actually want to have another snack before my strength training session. So I'm going to have potentially again something maybe like a peanut butter toast or something that has a little bit of protein, but mostly carb. Depending on the timing, sometimes I might do something with more protein if I have a couple hours or an hour before. Do my workout. I might have another protein option or like a small amount or small protein shake, and then have dinner at like 6 or 7. So I've already had 4 snacks and 3 meals. And if I'm really training hard, there are nights that sometimes I'll have another snack before I go to bed. It might be something like Greek yogurt and some granola. It really depends, but it's usually some sort of carb and protein combo. So they're right there, depending on the day, I might have something like 3 meals or even 4 meals if you think about my 2 breakfasts and then 3 snacks. So an athlete might actually be eating a lot more frequently on their heavy training days versus, maybe like a recovery day, you would not need to eat that many meals and snacks. But that's just an example. Like if I were working with somebody who were trying to lose weight, I would never recommend them to eat that much. So that's, the big difference there is just sports nutrition is going to involve a lot more, not only timing of meals, but the specific goals of the meal will be a little bit different. Like you'll have more targeted pre-exercise, might be more carb heavy, less protein depending on the timing. And then you might have more of a specific protein goal after exercise. So even within the day, the meals themselves are more kind of like there's more of a goal of that meal or a specific focus of that meal for a specific performance outcome or a specific aspect of recovery that most people who aren't engaging in that level of activity are going to be thinking about, right? So it's definitely going to be different in that way. Not to mention even like hydration and electrolytes and even thinking of it beyond that and beyond just the nutrition and what we eat aspect. But the timing matters, how many meals, there might be several, smaller meals or snacks just to make sure an athlete gets in what they need throughout the day, the calories, they need in order to not undereat and be able to fuel their exercise. So it's going to be very different between a regular nutrition and an athlete diet. Sports nutrition goals, the amount of each nutrient changes a bit. One way to think about this is, and I'll kind of again share some visuals, but a non-athlete might want to really focus on balanced meals because maybe they're not wanting to have energy crashes. Maybe they want to feel less hungry between meals. So they might really focus on a 1-to-1 ratio or a 1-to-2 ratio of protein to carbs. So if you had an example of this would be 30 grams of protein, you would maybe want to aim for 30 grams of carb or no more than 60. So no more than double that amount in carb. And so that might be an example of what somebody might want to aim for who's maybe not an athlete or, an athlete might be focusing on that on their recovery day or they, outside of their training window, maybe they're doing that sort of balance of protein to carb. But let's say an athlete who is doing I don't know, like a really long run or ride in the morning on Saturday, like their breakfast might want to be more of like a 1-to-3 or 1-to-4 ratio of protein to carbs. So if they have 20 grams of protein in that breakfast, they want to have maybe 80 or 100 grams of carb. So quite a bit of a skewed ratio. And then when they're done with their activity, might be something very similar where they're trying to get some protein, obviously, for repair, but they also want to get that carb to be able to replenish glycogen and start that recovery process. And it's going to probably be a ratio that's pretty high of 1 to 4, 1 to 5, maybe more, depends on the person. But that's just another example of how it might differ quite a bit between an athlete and a non-athlete. When we're thinking about the recovery process and the fueling process, we're really going to be focusing on protein and carbs. The other thing I want to mention here is that athletes, I unfortunately think, are sometimes susceptible to diet culture advice or rules because it's hard not to be, because again, I think sometimes these online influencers can be very convincing in their argument, or they're so sure of what they're saying, which is, I think, honestly, when you run into somebody that is so certain in what they're saying and there's no nuance, that's probably a red flag in my opinion. Because if someone is like, this is how it is, and I know this to be true, and there's no argument against it, or there's no nuance about this particular topic, then they probably actually don't know as much as they come off as knowing. And that's kind of dangerous. But I think a lot of these diet culture trends, a good example here would be the fasting protocols that we come across. I just see this a lot, especially as a woman in my early 40s and working with other women who are kind of in their perimenopausal years. Oh, you have to fast, got to do some sort of time restricted eating to be able to be healthy or metabolically healthy. And you can't eat within these hours. You can't eat past 6, and we got to do 16 hours of fasting. And that actually, for an athlete, for me personally, because I have tried some fasting where I would go in the morning and fast and maybe sometimes do fasted workouts, it actually increased my levels of cortisol and stress, and my recovery went way down because of that. And so, and just from the information I know about fasting and kind of what we're finding with women, and maybe more research coming out, is actually fasting isn't for athletes, for an active, very active woman doing high intensity training or even a lot of training. Fasting is not going to be a good approach for most. So I don't know. There's probably always going to be those individuals who do well with things. I really just think this is one of those examples where diet culture, or, you kind of get these people out here saying, oh, I'd be fasting, and that is just not a good recommendation for an athlete. So that's just an example of something that would fall outside of like sports nutrition recommendations. There's very few times I recommend fasting. I think I've mentioned doing some fasting workouts, and even then it's very sparing, very specific reason you would want to do that. It isn't something you want to do often. So often this, fasting and not eating and eating only in certain windows for most athletes is going to lead to underfueling and underperforming. So, just something to think about. Don't That's an example of one of those diet culture rules that I run into a lot with athletes. And I think when we hear all of these dire warnings about how if you're eating too much and gut health and metabolic health and all this, a lot of those types of things like to be thrown around as scare tactics. And I would just say, unless that person is some sort of PhD or has some extensive background, in knowledge in that area, I would be very wary of that. Another example is probably really a low carb approach. And I do know that athletes can follow a low carb approach and be successful, but it has to be done with care and thought to make sure that this individual is getting enough fuel in general. I think it's something that can be kind of thrown around that isn't a super helpful thing for most individuals, and kind of thrown around as like, oh, you can become more metabolically efficient. And I don't always agree that that's the only approach you should take to do that. It might only work in certain circumstances when somebody's maybe doing more of really ultra endurance events, but low carb and athletic performance usually don't go hand in hand. So it's just another example of some of those like rules or diet culture things that you kind of run into, or any sort of like extreme elimination diet. like Whole30 or like a paleo autoimmune unless you have an autoimmune disease. And if that's the case and you're an athlete with an autoimmune disease and you want to go down some sort of path like that, my suggestion, just like somebody who's doing a weight loss protocol, is to take your time, stop. You might have to delay your performance goals for a while to do something like that, where you do some sort of elimination to figure out gut health issues or autoimmune issues, and then go back to athletics after you've done that. So you might have to decrease the amount of exercise you're doing because they just don't go hand in hand. It's very hard to eat enough to perform when you're doing something that's very restrictive. So you kind of have to think about like potentially goals that are competing and figuring out a way to do one or the other but not both. And along that topic is that I've already kind of talked about this, but the energy needs for athletes are going to be much much greater than non-athletes. So somebody that's maybe just doing like 30 minutes to an hour of work, maybe just working out 3 days a week or 4 days a week, that person might need 2,000, maybe 2,500 calories, depending on how big they are, their size, their weight, male versus female. An athlete, on the other hand, may be training at least an hour a day, maybe two, so anywhere between maybe 7 hours to 15 or more a week will probably need um, you know, minimum 2,500, but probably more like 3 or 4,000, and in some cases even more, doubling the amount of energy needs almost in some cases. So that's going to be a lot more energy, and you have to get that energy from somewhere. And so then that kind of brings up my next point is the USDA guidelines, and I wanted to share that again because I shared it when I did the last episode with Justin. Unfortunately, if you're listening to the podcast and you don't have the visual on YouTube, I would just go and Google USDA dietary guidelines for Americans and take a look. It's basically like the food pyramid, but like flip, but it's not really flipped. It's like inverse. The grains are the bottom, and then you have the top where there's protein and veggies. And we talked about this in our last episode, so I'm not going to go into like my particular feedback or criticisms or what I like about it. But what I'm going to say is that for athletes, this is not going to quite be adequate because the fruits and the vegetables are great and I want athletes to consume that. But if they're kind of following the way I would interpret this, is that you would eat a heavier diet of like meats and milk and whole food, whole fat dairy and lots of vegetables and some fruits and butter. But obviously, if you're kind of following it that way, you're going to miss out on carb foods that are going to be necessary to fuel your activity. And on the very bottom, you have this tiny amount there, where it says whole grains, which are, arguably for an athlete, the old food pyramid guidelines where the grains are kind of the base of it would probably, or not even the grains, I'd say like the starches, because we want to kind of include starchy vegetables and beans, and maybe like fruits have carbs, but kind of the carbs would be more of the base, and then maybe the proteins and the veggies, and then at the very top would be kind of like the fats and things like that. The old pyramid would probably be a bit more appropriate for athletes, but in general, I don't think like an athlete would want to follow that in terms of if they were trying to use that as like the quantities they would need for each option. Although I do think, yes, we want to make sure we're getting a protein in fruits and vegetables. The other thing I think that maybe is lacking on here is, the sodium recommendations. Most athletes are going to need far more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium. Some people lose 1,000 milligrams of sodium in sweat just for an hour of exercise. That's probably not going to be adequate either. So what I would use, so I'm just kind of going through and showing you this kind of what it looks like, but it's mostly the food pyramid piece, so the reverse upside down pyramid that they've created. You can see that there. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm instead going to share another visual. So this visual is actually an athlete plate. So if you're listening to this and you want to Google this, you can. It's just a nice visual. It works really well, especially for like high school, college athletes when maybe because the problem with the pyramid is that it doesn't really allow us to visualize what this looks like on a plate. Like, great, you're giving me this thing, this reverse upside down pyramid scheme, but what does this mean for me, like as an athlete, how am I putting this into practice? What does this mean for me as a non-athlete? Like, what does this look like on my plate? And that's why I kind of liked the old plate guidelines in a way, because at least it was visual. You could kind of be like, okay, I'm on my plate. This is kind of what it looks like. So for athletes, I do think using the plate visual can be helpful. And so this is just something you can Google. It'd be like athlete plate hard training. There's one. This is the hard training day. There's some that are for easy, which is more like a typical plate, easy training, moderate training, hard training. But I think, most athletes training at least an hour a day, maybe more, probably lean more towards moderate to hard training. So this is why I'm showing this visual. And as you can see, like half the plate is going to be those starchies. Starch in and I put starchy vegetables here. I put whole grains, even some more of our processed grains, because sometimes we have to eat more processed grains in order to meet our energy needs or to avoid having GI distress. We can't just eat as athletes like fiber all the time and fiber all day long because we're going to have some GI issues potentially. So we also have to be mindful of that. So we have half of our plate on a hard training day might be grains or starchies. And then a quarter of the plate might be protein and a quarter would be vegetables. And in fact, sometimes I will do a plate where it's really like let's say it's a pasta dish. I have a pasta and meat or some kind of protein. And my vegetable might actually come off to the side in a big salad or something like that. So it's not always going to be a plate like this, depending on how hard or what my goal is for that meal. But it's going to be heavy on the starch and some good amount of protein, and the vegetable is going to be in there, or it's going to be mixed in into the plate somehow. Like maybe I'll mix broccoli in with my pasta sauce or something like that. But that's more of a visual that I think can be helpful for athletes on an easy training day, or if you're kind of more of a weight management goal. Half the plate would be fruits and vegetables, so big amount of fruit vegetables, and then like a small portion of a smaller, maybe quarter of the plate or less of whole grains or starches. So that includes potatoes, pastas, rice, legumes, breads, things like that. And then maybe a quarter or a little more of protein to make sure there's adequate protein there. And then the moderate plate, the biggest difference between moderate and hard is the amount of carbs. So carb goes up to almost half the plate on the hard training day. So it just kind of gives a good visual so you kind of can maybe moderate your carb goal day to day or how much you're eating day to day based off of the amount of exercise you're doing. So that's a visual I use sometimes. Obviously, if you want to get more in the weeds, you can log your intake throughout the day, kind of see where you're at, maybe calculate your needs, calorie needs, estimate carb needs, that kind of thing. You can get really into the weeds. You don't have, this is just a simple way to think of it, but just wanted to kind of illustrate it a little bit, how it's a bit different potentially between what an athlete might do and even what the current USDA guidelines are. And something to keep in mind, because I think sometimes we forget as athletes that we are special beings and we have special needs. No, we're just special in the sense that we do have needs that are different than the general population, right? So we don't want to follow what people are doing. So if you have like a spouse, if you're a high level athlete or you're training a lot and you have a spouse, or you're a high school athlete or a college athlete and you have friends who are not athletes, you do not want to be comparing what you're doing to what they're doing and what you're eating to what they're eating. It's just not going to be the same. So we want to keep that in mind. So let's move on. I think I illustrated that point in like 30 minutes. So hopefully I didn't bore everyone. But I just wanted to put that out there and give some food for thought on how things are a bit different for athletes. But then let's now switch gears for a little bit. I don't want to dive into this too much. I just wanted some background here as now you're thinking, I'm an athlete. I kind of know what sports nutrition is. I know that it's different. I kind of know what my needs are. But how do I put this into practice? Maybe you're the type of athlete who you had some setbacks that you really think were attributed to your nutrition and you want some help. And there's nothing wrong with asking for help. And oftentimes getting advice from an expert can be maybe something that propels you forward in your athletic goals and what you want to achieve. And so seeking out help from a nutritionist or dietitian, hopefully I'll explain the difference here, but would be a good thing, and oftentimes most people aren't going to lock you into like a specific program. For instance, when I work with people, I might meet with them once or twice and that's it because they just have some specific questions or very specific needs. And then sometimes I will meet with someone ongoing for a while to really help them dial in their nutrition. It doesn't have to be ongoing, although sometimes that can be helpful. So let's see, you want to pursue this, you want to go on and meet with someone. How do you know if someone is an expert or knows what they're talking about? So the one thing I want to mention here is that the word nutritionist is a bit ambiguous. There is no regulation on this particular word or anybody calling themselves a nutritionist. So sometimes I call myself a nutritionist, but there's no regulation. So anybody that you meet on the street who maybe did one certification class or a webinar, a 60-minute webinar on nutrition, may decide to call themselves a nutritionist. And that is probably problematic, because it's then how do you know if this person is legit? And I get that. It's kind of frustrating. But just be careful. If you're looking online for a nutrition coach or a nutritionist, that person could be very well qualified. Maybe they even have a PhD in nutrition, or they could be someone who just thinks they're very skilled because they took a nutrition class. And that is probably more dangerous. So be aware, not all people who call themselves nutritionists are legit. So I would personally suggest you look for somebody who is a registered dietitian because they've had to have at least 4 years of college in nutrition. And now most dietitians are required to have a master's degree in nutrition to be a dietitian. So it's even gone up another level of expertise there. At least a 4-year degree and then a master's degree. Personally, I have a master's degree in human nutrition. So my undergraduate was more of an exercise science degree. I went back, almost got a second degree in nutrition, and then got my master's instead. So I have a lot of background there, a lot of education. I think that's what you got to look for when you're looking for someone. And I would look for someone with a degree. Maybe they have a PhD. That might be good too, but just making sure that they have some level of advanced education in that area in which they are saying they are an expert in. Unfortunately, because nutrition, it involves a lot of nuance and expertise and knowledge about different types of lifestyles. You cannot take a 5-hour webinar class on nutrition and be able to really have any ability to truly help someone, I don't believe. So just be looking for that, making sure a sports dietitian would be great. Someone like myself, I call myself a sports dietitian because I have so many years of experience. Some sports dietitians actually have a board certification in sports dietetics, which is also the CSSD certification. And this means that they have had to have at least 2,000 hours of experience, 2,000 hours at least in sports nutrition, as well as a degree to get that certification. So if you would like someone with a specific certification, that's a great way to go. I've had that certification in the past. I'm working on getting recertified. That's a whole story of its own, but that is a good one to look for as well if you're kind of looking for somebody. And I think just do they have the level of experience working within the sport that you're doing? Because if you are a high level endurance athlete and you find someone that's working with the NFL or football, well, maybe at least that's better than the person with the 5-hour certification, but they might not have the ability to know everything about that sport. And I argue, like, if somebody is actually participating in endurance sports at some level and they're a nutritionist or a sports dietitian, that would be even better because they know what it's like to be 3 hours into a run and in that sort of pain cave situation, or what it's like to bonk, that heavy legs that you get, when you're starting to bonk and you're hitting the wall, and they know what it's like to put in that amount of training. And so to have someone like that actually participates is also, I think, personally helpful, but not necessary. But I would say probably helpful. Those are probably the biggest things I would want to mention there. Find somebody that knows what they're talking about, has experience, and the right credentials. And I think just lastly, like, there's a few key ways a sports dietitian can help. So if you're kind of not sure, like, well, how are they going to help me? What can they do for me? I just wanted to end my deep dive, how do I help people? And so I'm going to list out some various things. So personalized fueling is probably the number one thing I do for people who come work with me is creating some tailored meal plans for that individual or some templates of some sort of like, this is kind of how I would structure your meals. Just like I said for that day of heavy training, how I structured my day, I might do that for somebody based off their different days. So, really, a double day, two hard workouts or a workout in a strength training session, a recovery day versus a long run day, they're all going to be a little different. And so, a sports dietitian can help with that personalized fueling based off how to balance carbs and protein and all of those aspects and kind of helping you figure that out. And performance optimization. So, this is really more like what you would want to do to, in your competition or in your training to optimize your performance, whether that's some sort of like hydration strategies, fueling, maybe carb experiments to see how are you going to implement, a certain level of carbs per hour so that when you get to your race, you're fueling adequately. It's kind of like that window around the workout before and during and after that's going to optimize performance and working on that. Injury prevention actually is a big piece and recovery. So, especially someone who's very prone to injury, this is a great thing to think about is how is a dietitian going to help you? Maybe you need to repair tissue, damaged tissue, or things that you can think about in terms of nutrition that might reduce your injury risk or help you recover faster. So, or even avoid illnesses and immunity, maybe like help you improve your immune system, things like that. Body composition is one. So a lot of athletes, especially in the endurance community, want to have a better, maybe more muscle or be leaner, less body fat. And so body composition can be one. And I think this is really for me when I'm working with someone on body composition or weight management, how do we achieve this goal with it being realistic and avoiding harmful eating patterns. So this is kind of the risk people run into when they work with somebody who's maybe not a sports dietitian or isn't really skilled in this is for me my number one priority when working with people is no harm. So if I have caused someone to have disordered eating habits, I have done them wrong. That is, I do not want to have someone come work with me and end up with any sort of eating disorder, body dysmorphia, worsened relationship with food. So my number one goal is to make sure that whatever I'm recommending that at the end hopefully their relationship with food is improved and they haven't, if anything, maybe they've come away from disordered eating and not more towards it. So I always strive for that. I do not want, and I think that's one thing we want to always consider because sometimes when we work with someone that doesn't know what they're talking about, they might put food rules in place that are unnecessary that could lead to these types of behaviors. Sometimes I work with people who also have other conditions. Like athletes are generally healthy, but sometimes athletes have things like, in my case, I have the autoimmune disease, but sometimes they have food allergies. Personally, I work quite a bit with gluten-free athletes, celiac disease, because of my own personal experience with my son. I know a lot about being gluten-free. So if I have an athlete that also wants to make sure they're eating right in their gluten-free diet because of the celiac disease, I would absolutely be able to work with that person. Also diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, anemia. So there's a lot of reasons, medical reasons, why maybe an athlete has a medical condition and they want to work on sports nutrition. So because I have such a strong clinical background, that's something I could definitely help people with. And there's other dietitians like that. Some are more always have been in sport and they might have a little okay clinical backgrounds, and some dietitians have more strong clinical backgrounds. And I would say my clinical background is pretty strong. Supplement guidance too. So I think that's another place where we can kind of get influenced by influencers. You got to be taking that creatine. You got to be taking this pre-workout. You got to be taking this post-workout. People selling supplements that are trying to put themselves out there as experts, but their whole their supplement they own a supplement company, right? That's a little bit of like, yeah, I can't really trust you 100% because personally I don't sell supplements. I recommend them, but I do not personally make money off of supplements. So I feel like my supplement guideline, my guidance around supplements is as unbiased as I could possibly be because I don't get any sort of kickback. So keep that in mind too when you're picking someone to work with or following someone online. Education and skills, just helping someone be able to have the skills to do this on their own. Like my goal when I work with clients is to absolutely make sure at some point you're going to be like, okay, Katie, I've learned a lot. Like you have provided so much guidance for me, and I feel like I know what I'm doing now. I feel confident in my ability to fuel, and I don't really need you anymore. I know that's maybe not a very good business strategy, but for me, when I have a client that takes the information I provided, the education I provided, and then went on and used that beyond our working together, and they finally clicked for them, and they're like, I get it. That is a win for me because I want my clients to feel empowered and be able to go on and translate all of this information, be able to look through the BS online and be able to say, you know what? Now I feel like I got a good handle on this. And maybe occasionally they come back and they meet with me again for various reasons, but when they can go off on their own and be confident, I feel like I've really done my job as a sports dietitian. So something to think about there too. And eating disorder support would be the last one. So there are sports dietitians that work a lot more with eating disorders. I personally do some, but it depends on the level of eating disorder. So I will not work with people who are in active eating disorder treatment, but I will work with people who are maybe coming out of treatment and trying to sort of build their knowledge and go beyond and maybe helping them with their sports nutrition when they've already kind of gotten that support from maybe a more skilled eating disorder dietitian. So if you do have an active eating disorder, I would encourage you to find someone who really specializes in that area. And then when you're ready, you can come in and talk to me because I do have some background in that. I just don't work specifically with eating disorders. So one thing to think about. But basically, registered dietitian or sports dietitian, they translate the complex nutritional science into practical science-specific advice. And they're just helping athletes make smart food choices. And that's kind of the end of my talk today. Hopefully I didn't bore you all to death with it. Just giving you some food for thought, some things to think about when you're maybe wanting to work with somebody, how a dietitian maybe can help you, what to look for when you're trying to plan a sports-specific dietary approach. But as always, if you want to contact me with questions or maybe even to inquire about working with me, there are certain states in which I take insurance through a few different avenues. So if you think you might be able to see me via insurance, you can always reach out and ask about that as well. But again, my email is katie@fuel2run.com. So that's a good way to get a hold of me. And thanks a lot. And I'll look forward to doing another deep dive in the future. If you have something you want me to cover, please let me know because I love anything you're interested in. I'm happy to cover. All right. Thanks everybody. And it's been interesting. I don't know. I just feel like I've been blabbing on for a while. So I'll let you go, but take care and we'll see you next time.
That wraps up today's episode of the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Endurance sports have a way of teaching us patience, humility, and resilience, lessons that carry far beyond the workout. Progress in endurance sports doesn't come from shortcuts. It comes from consistency, discipline, and doing the work when it's not glamorous. Wherever you are on your endurance journey, keep trusting the process and honoring the work you put in each day. If today's episode resonated, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone to help on their endurance journey. Don't forget to join the conversation on our social sites to help build and foster a community where we all learn and support one another. We'll be back with more stories and insights from Coach Justin and Katie. Until then, visit the podcast website at theenduranceathletejourney.buzzsprout.com for more episodes from the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast. Have questions or comments about the podcast? Feel free to send us an email at theenduranceathletejourney@gmail.com. For all things coaching, visit Coach Katie at fuel2run.com and Coach Justin at tabularosaracing.com. Again, thank you for listening to the Endurance Athlete Journey podcast, and remember, to find joy in the journey.